Right, so we just want to move on to the last part of our discussion this afternoon. We've explored some of the changes that have taken place, quite significant changes that have taken place in the construction industry over the last 10 years or so. To what extent do you think the current economic downturn, what sort of impact that current economic downturn is likely to have on procurement strategies and ways of working within the construction industry?
Before I answer that, I think it's worthwhile reflecting on what's happened over the past 2-3 years, because I would suggest that certainly in the commercial sectors that the opportunities that have been there in a very hot market have actually given quite a few clients a sort of sense of disillusionment about actually what does partnering and collaborative working give to the client. Obviously, in terms of when things are busy, people will respond to that in terms of maximising the opportunities that they've got. And quite clearly, in the private sector, developers were doing extremely well on the back of rising capital values. And we saw, in many instances, very high levels of price escalation, often in negotiations which should have been conducted in what might describe as a more collaborative way. And if one looks back over the last 4 or 5 years where there was almost a sense of market failure in that there wasn't enough capacity to deliver the workload, so clients had to package their projects in a way which was attractive to the supply chain, which often meant that they went down a 2-stage tendering route, which would be seen as being a collaborative route. What was actually finding there was that was a means of contractors transferring risk back up to the client, and quite often some of those negotiations were done in what might be described as a sort of 11th hour way, which left people a little bit surprised, a little bit disillusioned, and almost with the sense of, well, what goes around comes around. And that...
So you're indicating there was some degree of opportunistic behaviour on behalf of the supply chain?
Yes, certainly in terms of the levels of price escalation that was seen. One can see that on one side, one could see that the contracting supply chain was probably seeking to maximise its revenue, its overheads, in recognising that other parts of the industry were doing quite well. The problem there was, however, that that sort of activity often challenges the viability of projects, because land values go up, the planners want more, and such like. So a lot of projects became very difficult to deliver at as the boom came to its peak. And we actually found clients moving away from particular procurement routes to maximise the competitive pressure they might be able to achieve. And certainly in the public sector, I think projects were suffering a lot from not being able to secure bids which aligned with their quite tight affordability limits. So in that sense, we moved into a market of downturn, which was probably primed with a little bit of cynicism in terms of, were we all working in this together, or in the end, were we still acting in the classic client-contractor relationship, which is that both is trying to, of course, secure their best position out of what's effectively a commercial exchange. As we move into downturn, I would say universally every client that I've spoken to wants to continue to work in a positive way, because they know that a lot of competitive behaviour is a zero-sum game. In the end, to some extent, there's an awful lot more effort spent in terms of dealing with disputes and such like that could be better focused elsewhere. But at the same time, they recognise that the extreme situations which we find ourselves in will also drive contractors to take particular decisions. And I think this became very apparent at the last quarter of 2008 when, according to our market forecasts, prices started to drop quite considerably. And I don't think clients were necessarily saying to people, you must drop your prices like that. This was happening because workload had dropped. What do people do? They immediately need to secure workload. Contractors in the end are turnover-driven businesses. If the turnover isn't coming through, that's when problems start to emerge. Now, I'm not a contractor, so I'm not going to try and anticipate what their strategies are. But you don't need to be a sort of business genius to work out that organisations that are suddenly prepared to drop their margins considerably are going to be recovering that from somewhere, probably from the supply chain initially, and then possibly from the client through their contractual entitlements. So that ratcheting down of pressure, be it on self-employed labour, be it on material suppliers, I think is almost an inevitable aspect of the market we're in, unless people can stick to a negotiated position. And one aspect that I would almost put caution on is that no client-contractor relationship exists in a vacuum, so that a negotiated collaborative settlement with a contractor who would like to work in that way will always be taken against the background of all the other projects that they're doing, and they might be with clients who want to work in a completely different way, projects that have difficulties for whatever reason, supply chains that have their own problems. And so the events from one project are almost necessarily going to impact on others. And certainly we've seen clients suddenly finding themselves facing claims which they probably haven't seen for years from contractors behaving in a different way to which they used to. And clearly quite a bit of that is the people having to respond in extremis. But it's also worthwhile thinking about who's in charge now. And the people who are probably in senior positions in contracting organisations were probably the people who were working in the industry through the early 80s, came through the last recession. Their memories are, this is how you survive. And actually the people who worked through the last 10 years might not be in such an influential position. And so we might well see an evolution going forward, but as we're focused on survival, I think we're going to see a lot of going back to type behaviours, which will be regrettable, but I think difficult to avoid. There's a very interesting report out in the moment by an organisation called Equal Partners. It's partly funded by consultants and contractors. And again, it sets out a very clear case for why we should continue to work collaboratively. But again, the case in always is in terms of faced with not winning that work, having to lay off people, potentially putting your business at risk, or bidding competitively to securing it and then sorting out the problem once you've got it. I think I know what particular Hobson's choice organisations will take. Wrapping up and looking forward, the problems that the industry is going to face are going to need, I think, more joined up thinking rather than less. I can envisage coming out of this particular downturn with quite a different economic model, an economic model that is less frothy, where buildings potentially have less inherent value than they do at the moment. So one has to be able to deliver the same function at potentially a lower cost. And that's going to ask some awkward questions of clients in terms of what do they want to prioritise, what's most important, what's least important. Some awkward questions of design teams and delivery teams in terms of, well, given the set of compromises we're being asked to make and our own values, how do we come up with the best solution? And so some form of joined up working has to come from this. And I think we will see evolution in technology, possibly evolution in terms of the way projects are set up, insurances and such like, which will be a response to some of the problems which we will have to address over the next 4 or 5 years. But I can't see either the industry staying as it was in the mid-noughties, I suppose we'd describe it now, in terms of that being a paradigm as how we should operate, and certainly not going back to type of the pre-Latham, pre-Egan agenda for anything other than the shortest period of time.
Okay, on that optimistic note, Simon Rawlinson, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much indeed.